is Zach Schumm. I am relatively new to Iowa, but I'm not really new to diagnostics. I have been in diagnostics for, I guess, going into my third year now. I was doing some diagnostic work out at Utah State University, but I'm from the East Coast, as Alicia also mentioned. So I've had a lot of insect experience, I guess, on multiple sides of the country, and that can be really beneficial for a lot of reasons. It also interestingly enough, pests are managed differently in different areas, and also there are different insects in different areas as well. So because I'm relatively new to Iowa, and because of the ongoing drought that we've been experiencing, I still have a lot to learn about the insects that are in Iowa. So my job, as Alicia also mentioned, is to assist anybody, whether it's a homeowner or a large corporation, with identifying insects from the home and garden. So those can be insects from the garden, they can be insects that are in your house. That is my job, and to identify them and then to assist with any management-related needs if there are any management-related needs. I always bring up, I'm glad that Alicia read my bio from the website, the ISU website, because my passion has really been in conservation ecology and conservation biology. So I've always wanted to conserve insects, and that never really ended up happening just because of the random path that happened with graduate school. And then I finished grad school as soon as the pandemic shutdowns happened. And the one job that was available right across the hall was in diagnostics. And I've found to really love what I do because I get to teach people about insects. And as Alicia mentioned, even the insects that people love to hate. And this talk is called Identification and Management of Common Vegetable and Fruit Pests in Iowa. But I also like to encourage people to really understand the potential beneficial qualities of things that we would normally consider pests. Most of us listening in, if you do any gardening or if you live in a structure, you see things indoors or you see things on your plants and you don't like it there. It's really common to use the term pest, and I rarely use the term pest, at least on my own time. However, certainly I have it here in the talk title, because that's what we commonly refer to these things as. So I will be doing a little bit of talking throughout this PowerPoint to sort of maybe challenge our ideas and our perception of insects, because not everything is bad, even if sometimes they negatively impact our spaces and our plants. So I like to start a lot of these talks, and I guess before I jump into the good stuff, I do have contact information at the bottom of the slides here. I do encourage people to reach out to us. So that's our direct line to our diagnostic lab and our email address. We love to take questions about anything plant pest related. We have me, the insect expert, and we also have a plant pathologist who also has some nematode knowledge as well. And I'll maybe talk a little bit more about nematodes during this as well. And if we have time at the end, I would also just like to share some more things about the clinic and what we do. But I'm going to try to stay on topic here, at least for the first chunk, and just talk about identification and management of these common fruit and vegetable pests. And I mentioned already that I like to really challenge what a pest means. It's really common or easy to go outside and look at our plants and see something like an aphid that a lot of us are already somewhat familiar with, and say aphids are bad, aphids are a pest. And I don't like defining insects, aphids, like numerous aphids on a plant, necessarily as a pest. And the reason is, as we get into these different insects throughout this talk, is because just because we see something that's plant feeding doesn't necessarily mean it is a pest in that particular situation or on that particular plant. So the most common question, or one of the most common situations that we see here in the diagnostic clinic, is a person finds an insect on their plant and they send us a picture of it, or they give us a call and they say, I found this weird thing on my XYZ plant. What is it, and do I need to kill it? And it's not really the best gut reaction to have to an insect that we're seeing on our plants. And I've been asked numerous times, well, how can you tell if something's beneficial, or how can you tell if something is a pest or at pest status? And I'm going to preface this by saying that this is a huge generalization. However, what I like to do, or what I like to suggest, is if you walk up to your plant and you are seeing, it's always good to look at how many of that insect you're seeing. Are you seeing just one and you've never seen this insect before? Are you seeing a few of them and they're kind of scattered around your garden? Or is this just one weird insect that you've never seen before and you have no idea what it is? That's a very common situation because there's so many millions of insects out there, maybe not in Iowa, but millions of species of insects. And I mean, I'm an entomologist. I'll never see a tenth of the insects that are out there, right? So what I like to do is encourage people to, look at, really observe the landscape a little bit before we have that gut reaction, or before you just look at an insect and say, I'm going to get it off my plant because I'm not quite sure what that is. Are you seeing one or a couple? If you're only seeing one or a couple of something, it's unlikely to be a concern, or at least unlikely to be an immediate concern. Again, we're kind of generalizing because there are some insects where one individual can transmit a plant pathogen to your plant, and then you could lose an entire plant because you got unlucky with one individual. That's certainly possible, but it's quite uncommon, I would say. If you see several, if we look at this upper right picture with all of the aphids, you're seeing hundreds of individuals on your plants. It's likely in cases where you're seeing hundreds of individuals or dozens of individuals even, or just a handful, that those insects are plant feeding to some extent. They're probably feeding on some plant tissue. But again, that does not necessarily mean that the insects, even if they're in high numbers and they are plant feeding, it does not necessarily mean that it is considered a pest, or it's not considered at pest status. So actually at a population that's going to actually damage our plants. These are very hard questions to answer when it comes to identifying potential problems on our plants. That is why Iowa State University Extension exists, and that is why my position exists. So just before we have those gut reactions, it's always good to, maybe before we say, oh, I'm going to see this bug, I don't know what it is, I'm going to remove it, or, oh, I see, a little group of aphids on one stem of my plant, I'm going to spray pesticides across my entire garden. It's good to take other steps before we actually take those actions. So some of the insects I'm going to talk about are probably quite familiar to some of you, so there's going to be some review. That's perfectly fine. What I like to do, I like to share a lot of photos, and I like to limit the amount of text that I have on slides. This is probably my most word-heavy slide. So in the handout that was shared with you all, again, if you don't have it, we can get that to you. I put some other notes for those insects on there. I really like to talk and I really like to interact. So webinars can actually be a little bit challenging for me because I like to ask questions while I'm talking. Certainly online, that's not quite possible. So utilize those notes. I really encourage folks to, listen and take notes based on what I'm saying, because I often say a lot of things that aren't on slides. And then certainly email me with questions that don't get answered, or just, there's not enough time to address them. Send us some emails at that email address on the bottom right of the screen. I love answering questions, so there's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end of this. I also want to note that I have not been in Iowa for that long, as has been mentioned, and last year was another drought year, and we really did not get a lot of pest insects in the clinic, other than a couple of common ones. Believe it or not, I did not get any squash bug inquiries, and I'm sure everybody that's listening that does any cucurbit gardening knows that squash bugs are an absolute terror in some years. So the ones that I chose to put into this talk is not exhaustive, but there's some of the ones that I know are often problematic. But I'm sure that there are many pests out there that I will start seeing more as we hopefully get some more rain in future years. So squash bugs, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar. So they do feed on all cucurbits, but they are mostly damaging to squash and pumpkin. There's probably some of you here that have said, well, I grew another type of cucurbit that was absolutely demolished. Certainly possible, but we tend to see most of the damage on squash and pumpkin. So adults are up to 1 inch in size. We see an adult there on the right with some eggs. So that's a little egg mass, those little brown spheres on the leaf there. And this is an insect that's going to overwinter as an adult. So the stage that you see there on the right is how it's going to overwinter. It's going to overwinter in the ground. So leaf litter, mulch, things of that nature. Anything that it can hide in on the ground, it's going to overwinter. So in the spring, once it warms up a little bit, they are going to emerge from their overwintering status, or diapause, we call it. They're going to find plant material, cucurbits, most of the time, and then they're going to lay eggs and then start that new generation of squash bugs that year. And I always talk about this one first because it's one that I always get emails about, and I say this out in Utah because we would get squash bug questions every day. I have not experienced that in Iowa just yet. But people always contact us to manage squash bugs after they become a problem. So they're already seeing a lot of these nymphs. We see this nymphal stage or immature stage on this pumpkin here to the right. They contact us with that picture and they say, what do I do? They're covering all of my plants. Most of the time, especially if they're in this adult stage that we see here on this slide, it's already too late to take the best action. The best thing that you can possibly do is manage those in the nymph or in the egg stage, excuse me, because the eggs are easy to scout for, they don't move, and all you have to do is squash them. So, go out early in the year. They start laying eggs around early June. You want to be looking at these leaves, the top side, but mostly the underside of those leaves, scouting for these egg masses. They're usually, I would say the one that's on the screen right now is about average for a size. You can see anything from 10 to maybe 35 eggs or so, but I would say on the screen, I haven't counted those, but somewhere in the realm of 20 to 22 eggs is pretty typical for an egg mass of squash bugs. I don't know the exact average or the data on that. And they're typically going to lay these egg masses in crevices of the leaves. So if you have those really big leaf veins where they can get some extra added protection from the elements, that's usually where you're going to find these. And I can't stress enough that if you grow any cucurbits, particularly squashes, you really want to start checking those as soon as you start seeing leaf material out in the field. Weather changes and just how hot or warm it is that particular year is going to change how early or how late the squash bugs come out and start laying eggs. So definitely as soon as you start having leaf material to check, if you can just check that every few days, especially when it's earlier in the season, smash them, squeeze them between your fingers. You can take a piece of tape and just rip the egg masses off. I find it easiest just to smash them when I see them. Some people, I mean, I'm sure a lot of home gardeners are fine getting their hands dirty, but they do ooze and break open a little bit, but you really have to start doing that early in the year. I really don't recommend any insecticides most of the time for squash bugs, especially for home gardening situations, because the ones that we like to manage, or hopefully like to manage with insecticides, are again these nymph stages and these adult stages when any amount of insecticide is probably not going to solve your problem if it's this bad. So really look at the egg stage. There's a lot of people where I just say, you might not be able to do anything about them this year, but next year, make sure you're scouting really early in the year. There are some insecticides available, but they are mostly effective for this nymphal stage. So if you couldn't get around to scouting, or if the nymph population is absolutely massive, then there are some insecticide options, but honestly, I've rarely recommended it. But if you do have any situations that you're curious about or would like to know more about your situation, again, send us an email, send us some photos to show us how bad the situation is. I'd be happy to develop some sort of personalized management plan for you if there's something really useful available. So another favorite and another really common one are cucumber beetles. So there are two types of cucumber beetles that you can find here. You can find spotted cucumber beetle, which is the one that we see there on the right, has spots, conveniently enough. And then we have the striped cucumber beetle, which is the one on the left, which, as the name would suggest, has stripes. So this is one of those insects that I think we have a misconception about what stage of the insect is actually problematic. If you have like flowers, or let's say you're a cut flower grower or a gardener, and you have some flowers that are really looking tasty to some cucumber beetles, they can do some damage to the flower itself or to the leaves themselves on, cucumbers is one of the big ones. But the larvae is really, to me, the most problematic life stage of the cucumber beetle for your plants. So how this works is the larvae will be underground. They will be feeding on the roots of the plants, and that can really cause some problems for just movement of water and nutrients up into the plant. But we don't really see those very often. We like to really see them and hate them when they're feeding on our leaves and our flowers, which again, totally acceptable. But a lot of the root feeding of the larvae, the immature stage, is really, really important as well. I will note that a lot of pests can transmit diseases. I am not a plant pathologist, but just note that they can transmit bacterial wilt to your plants. One of the first and best things you can do if you see any wilting plant, whether you know it's from cucumber beetles or something else, is just hand remove the plant. So remove that wilted plant, make sure that you're not accidentally providing more material for more transmission of bacterial wilt or other potential viruses to other plants. You can also send the clinic pictures of your potentially diseased plants, and we can recommend if you need to remove it or not. But what I do recommend for, there's a couple things. You can use trap crops. In the little handout I gave you, I wrote down some of the trap crops that you can utilize, that you would just essentially plant around your gardening area where you're growing things that you're actually going to want to harvest. Plant them a little bit earlier in the season than your actual garden plants that you're trying to harvest from. And then you can hopefully kind of trap those beetles outside of the gardening area that you're trying to harvest from. Trap crops can be pretty effective for cucumber beetles, but you do have to get those plants out a little bit earlier in the year. When you see them in the field, either the spotted or striped cucumber beetles, you can just hand remove them. There's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, we're not going to recommend you dig in the soil and harm your plants just to pull larvae out of the soil. But this is kind of what they look like. You can see, well, the ones on the right, we have some larvae that are just feeding on the rind of a cantaloupe. So they can also just feed on fruiting parts of the plant. On the left here, we kind of have what they will do to your to roots of plants as well. They'll feed into it and really just cut off circulation. So another thing that is really important, and I guess I should mention this for squash bug as well, is sanitation of the garden area after the growing season. So after you have harvested all of your plants, you don't want to leave as really much at all plant debris on the ground, because that just provides a lot of overwintering habitat and help keeps the bugs nice and safe for the winter. Although cucumber beetles tend to migrate, but we don't have to get into that. At least many of them migrate. So you want to keep weeds at a minimum. Again, remove any of those plants that are showing signs of wilt. Reduce the amount of overwintering habitat for them by reducing plant debris. And yeah, so and I guess too with those trap crops, and I put this in the notes, I believe as well, is that those trap crops that you put up, if you decide to put them up, you can treat those with insecticides a little bit more readily. And I'd be happy to provide more information on that if you send me some more information about what's going on. Okay, another one of my favorites, because I'm a butterfly and moth guy. I think another one that's kind of, well, I don't want to say misunderstood, but maybe I'm just biased and love moths and butterflies too much. But we have two main hornworms that can damage tomato crops in Iowa. There are certainly some other small ones that we never really see out there. Although for Iowa, I'm not sure because I haven't seen any myself since I'm kind of new here. But tomato and tobacco hornworms are very common on tomato plants. And I have to say that I often notice that they're often present, but they're often missed because even though they tend to get massive, they are kind of hard to find. I used to do a lot of scouting in vegetable plots out in Utah where tomato hornworm and tobacco were quite big problems. And it was amazing the number of times that I would be scouting one of my stink bug traps that I studied. And a technician would come back behind me and check the same trap and then look up and find like 2 or 3 hornworms. Like they're so well camouflaged. And I often like to tell people that there's probably more of them in the landscape than you notice. They can do quite a bit of damage to tomato plants, but it really depends on the situation. And seeing 1 or 2 of them is not really an end-all be-all. Even though they can consume a lot of plant material, they certainly can once they get large. Most people tend to notice them once they're already huge, and even then they tend to blend in. So I think they're quite beautiful as adults if you've never seen one. A lot of people call them hawk moths, sometimes sphinx moths, or in this particular case, tomato and tobacco hornworm moths. They're generically brown in color, brown with some white and tan, but their abdomens can be like really pretty. So tomato hornworm um, has these like yellow stripes on them, but some of these species are really, really beautiful. This is a sweet potato hornworm here that has really bright pink stripes. The picture doesn't really do it justice. I actually don't know any of the hosts for sweet potato hornworm, but I'm assuming sweet potato is one of them, but you never know. Good identification characteristic, and I think the next slide will do this more justice, but I have a tomato hornworm here on the top right, and you can tell the difference between the tomato and the tobacco hornworm. On the tomato hornworm, many of the life stages will have this V-shaped or chevron-shaped striping pattern on the side of the larvae, or at least the larger larvae. Smaller larvae, it's kind of hard to tell. Tobacco hornworm are a little bit different. Tobacco hornworms tend to just have one stripe, and they don't really have that chevron or V pattern that the tomato hornworm does. In any case, they can consume a lot of plant material. They can feed on tomatoes. So, they can be a concern if you have like a really bad issue, but I guarantee you there's probably more of them out there than you're seeing, especially if you have several tomato plants. So just be on the lookout for a lot of that defoliation of the plants, and then scout as often as you can or as often as you want to. Turn the leaves over, look at the stems. They like to hang out on stems like this one is here. And just hand remove them if you want to. If you don't want to squish them or you don't want to throw them in a bucket of water, I mean, however you like to kill things. I usually just recommend, well, for me, I just personally leave them there because I care about the caterpillar more than I do the plant most of the time. But you can just put them in a bag or a container and throw them in the freezer. And 24 to 48 hours in the freezer is fine if you don't want to squish them and get guts everywhere, especially when they're huge like that. So a lot of times though, and this is when I get into, is everything a pest, even if it feeds on our plants? It's can be beneficial in some cases to just let the landscape do its thing. We have this one on the left here. This is a tobacco hornworm that is parasitized with Burkhanid wasps. And there are many, many parasitic insects out there that are helping us in our garden landscapes that never really get a lot of credit. But they're doing a lot of work out there reducing pest populations. If you're not familiar with these, this is just a parasitic wasp that has laid its egg inside the larvae of the or the larvae of the tobacco or tomato hornworm. Every caterpillar probably has a Burkhanid wasp that can do this to them. The wasp will feed on the caterpillar, and then they will pupate sort of like this, attached to the exterior of that caterpillar. It'll kill the caterpillar, and then the wasps will emerge and start a new generation on another caterpillar somewhere. And part of the reason why I like to encourage people to understand the beneficial qualities of what we would typically call a pest is because if there is no pest material out there, it's a lot harder to encourage the populations of beneficial parasitoids, predators, and beneficial insects that we know to be beneficial. So unless I'm seeing pests, and this goes for most cases, unless I'm seeing a pest completely ravaging my garden, I let it go. I'm okay losing some of my harvest if it means that I'm encouraging beneficial insects in the landscape. And having food sources and having a host for a parasitic insect can be really beneficial. And that's one of the main ways that we can have beneficial insects is by providing them with food. For Burkhanid wasps, one of the big food items or host items is caterpillars that feed on our plants. So just be noteworthy of that. Maybe the next time you see one, if you're only seeing one, think about it for a little bit and see how bad the issue is. If you just see one caterpillar, not really a big deal, unless you only grow one tomato plant and you have two giant caterpillars destroying the whole thing. Okay, stink bugs. It was really funny because when Alicia mentioned that I did my research on the brown marmorated stink bug, I had done this whole PowerPoint, or at least most of it. And I was like, I should probably add another insect to it. Like, what should I add? Couldn't really think of a good one. And then I was like, oh, shoot, I didn't even add stink bugs, which is what I know the most about. So I will note that there are so many species of stink bugs out there. There's well over 100 species of stink bugs in North America, which people are always shocked by because we only tend to see a couple of them. The brown marmorated stink bug is a non-native species that I studied in Delaware and then in Utah. It is present in Iowa, but it's more of a nuisance indoor situation pest. Not really a massive issue for our crops or our gardens just yet. Could that change at some point? Maybe, but I'm doubtful of that. So just note that there are many species of them. We tend to only see a few. And they are plant feeders, but this is one where I rarely see them becoming problematic in home gardens. A couple of times it's happened, especially for cabbage, for a stink bug that's called, well, I call it mergantia. It's called a harlequin bug is the common name. Otherwise, I don't really see a lot of major issues from stink bugs. One of their big identification characteristics is that they're shield-shaped. So you have this, if we look at this picture at the top right, we have almost a perfect shield. It has a five general sides on it. We go across the back, down the side. It angles in towards the tip of the abdomen and then goes back up. Squash bugs kind of look like that as well. So just seeing a shield shape is not a definitive characteristic to confirm a stink bug. However, for Iowa gardens, it will probably work most of the time if you see this shield shape and it's not super elongated like a squash bug. I have to note too that insects, are really confusing. There's a lot that feed on plants, but there's also some stink bug relatives that are beneficial. The one in the bottom there is called the two-spotted stink bug. That is a beneficial species. That is a predator. This one, I believe, loves larvae that feed on potato. So you might not see a ton of these in Iowa specifically, even though they're here, I'm pretty sure. But there are a lot of species out there, which is why I go back to If we're only seeing a couple of them, do we really have to worry about them? Again, there's some caveats to that. But if you're concerned about something, that is a good opportunity to take a picture of it, send a picture to the clinic here, and say, is this a beneficial species of stink bug or is it a pest? Because some of them look remarkably like each other. And again, they don't usually cause a lot of damage, with some caveats, because if some feed on small berry plants, or small berries or small fruits, or if you have a lot of stink bugs feeding on your one apple tree that you have in your yard, they can do some damage. But I often think and often see and experience that managing them often costs more than just losing a little bit of harvest. If you're only losing a couple percent of your apples, why are we going to spend a lot of money to spray that entire tree when they're really not going to cause a lot of damage? Again, it really depends on the situation. It can be a situation by situation basis, which is why the clinic is available if you have any questions about your particular scenario. So I do recommend tolerating stink bugs when you see them. If you see any that you're pretty sure is plant feeding, then you can certainly hand remove them. There's not going to be any major issues if you do that. But if you do have especially like small fruits, so out in Utah, we had some berry production. Raspberry was like pretty big out there for home gardeners. Quite frankly, I don't know how many people or the extent of raspberry gardening we have here in Iowa because I'm new. But for those small fruits, it can be a little bit more of an issue. But for most situations, not a huge deal. Another situation where I really encourage people to consider leaving them because they have these parasitic wasps. On this left-hand picture, we can see this little tiny parasitic wasp. They're only a couple of millimeters long that will fly around and search for the egg masses of stink bugs, parasitize the stink bug eggs, and then you have more parasitoid wasps to go out and do it again and again. If you remove all your stink bugs, or if you're dead set on spraying all of your plants to get rid of pests in general, you're not really doing a good job at encouraging those beneficial insects that are already doing or trying to do a lot of that work for you. On the right here, we just have nymphs of the brown marmorated stink bug, and then we have an adult brown marmorated stink bug. They are in Iowa if you see them. I just put pictures because that's what I spent years and years of my life studying at this point. So I'm kind of getting tired of seeing them, but I still think they're pretty cool. So I'll give them a pass. Okay, everybody's favorite, spider mites. So I'm sure that most of us, if you do any home gardening, you're somewhat familiar, or like fruit and vegetable gardening, you're somewhat familiar with spider mites. I only brought them up because they are very common and they tend to be really bad in drought years. So in Iowa recently, spider mites have likely been a lot worse than they have been in really wet years or really heavy rainfall years. So their diagnostic characteristics are pretty straightforward, but they are really small. So we have this leaf here on the left, and we see all this webbing that's going between the leaves. And we see a bunch of these really small mites that if you had a hand magnifier, you could very clearly see them. Spiders, unless you have an egg case that emerged and there's a bunch of little mini spiders running around, they don't really have this behavior where they're congregating on webs. So if you see these really thin webbing materials going between leaves or stems, and you see a bunch of little critters on them, probably spider mites, but don't rule out that it could have just been a spider egg case that recently hatched. But if you have really good magnification, you can see our most common species and identify it pretty easily, the two-spotted spider mite. Not all of them have spots, though, which is another importance of using diagnostic clinics to help you identify your insects. Because even though most of the time they look generally the same, you can find two-spotted spider mites without spots. Just like you can find other species of spider mites that usually don't have spots but look like they have spots. So again, just utilize resources, utilize the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic, and we are here to help you. That is what we do, and that's what I like doing the most. So I love identifying critters. Please send them up. For spider mites, and this goes for any plants, try to limit your drought stress. In drought years, make sure your plants are getting supplemental water. As soon as you have plant material present, make sure you're starting to scout for them. This is the typical symptom that we tend to see from really heavy infestations of spider mites. You just get a lot of spotting and blotching on leaves. You can see it on the top and on the bottom. This would be probably from a pretty severe infestation. If it's a little bit of a lesser infestation, probably these same patterns, just a lot less. Limit the amount of weeds. That can be really important. I think in a lot of home garden situations, a lot of us are already doing that. But when I've worked with orchard growers in the past, this is out in Utah, who grew a lot of peaches, apples, tart cherry, excuse me, tart cherries. Uh, Weeds were often associated with or positively correlated with spider mites. So there were a lot of weeds in that particular orchard. We would tend to see a lot more spider mites. So utilize weeding as an effective strategy for these in addition to some of these other things. You can, if you have a really sturdy plant, you can just use a hose to jet spray off spider mites. That's a really good chemical-free way to manage them. But you want to make sure that it's safe for the plant. You don't want a really flimsy, delicate plant to be sprayed with a jet stream of water. But over time, it can actually make a pretty big impact. In Utah, we had the problem where we had to sometimes get water delivered to some towns. So we wouldn't recommend that to people that don't have water, but that's not as much of an issue in Iowa. For severe situations, there are some chemicals available. I'd be happy to jump into that a little bit more if you just contact me. Um, but most of the time, I would say for home gardeners, I've never had to recommend any chemicals for spider mites, other than maybe one or two scenarios where there was no other option and something had to be done immediately. Just checking my time here. As expected, I talk a lot more than I think I'm going to. Aphids, another one of our best friends. I like to bring them up most of the time because they're a little bit more interesting and diverse than we tend to experience. There's so many species out there, and I think in home gardens we tend to only see like 4 or 5 of them. So I would say that most plants have at least one aphid, at least most broadleaf trees and garden plants that we grow here in Iowa probably have an aphid that would feed on it at some point. I usually like to say that they aren't always as bad of a problem as we think they are. That can certainly be untrue for some garden plants, but they're occasional pest status insects most of the time. They're not always problematic, even if you're seeing a bunch of them. Some of them can transmit diseases, sort of like the spotted and cucumber beetle and striped cucumber beetles. So note that as well. And their cool identification characteristic are these little cornicles. If you have a magnification device, just a hand lens, sometimes the zoom on your camera, just your phone camera can do the trick. If you zoom in really close, you can see these 2 little appendages coming out of the back side of aphids. These are called cornicles, which they just use to secrete some protective coverings and things of that nature. Most aphids have it. If you look at this picture on the right, like this one right here, hopefully you can see my cursor. There's a little black colored cornicle. If you see those 2 cornicles on something that's generally pear-shaped, it's probably an aphid. But this is hugely problematic because a lot of them have wings. Some species have wings for some of their life stages and not others. Very, very complicated life history that we don't have the time to get into today, but aphids are super interesting insects. I will note here too that some cornicles are so small that you can't really see them until you put them under a microscope. Again, that's why my job exists. I can help you identify things that look like an aphid, but you can't see their cornicles. I do recommend hand removal. Again, the spraying with a hose technique as well. If you have a plant that just has one heavily infested branch, this is also really common for like trees, fruit trees, for example. You can just prune off that branch or prune off that little area of the plant as long as it's otherwise safe for the plant. And that can usually solve your problem. So this one right here on the top right, I actually don't know what kind of plant this is, but we see some of the symptoms of aphids. We see some leaf curling. It's on the tip of the branch. You could just prune that branch off as long as it's not a problem on the rest of the plant. Most of your problem is solved. I also have to note that we're talking about fruit and vegetables here today, but if you see this on broadleaf trees, I never really consider them pests if you're seeing this on broadleaf trees. Most of the time, your tree is going to be just fine, even if you just let them exponentially grow throughout the season. A lot of us see like the bending leaves and things like that, and we kind of panic a little bit because our tree doesn't look perfect. I gave another talk early last year that it was called "Perfect Looking Plants Are Underwhelming," because we often have that gut reaction to our plants. We see some symptoms and we say, "Oh no, like I have to go get a chemical and spray, or I have to do something about this insect." But again, if we get rid of every single thing that feeds on our plants, we're not really encouraging beneficial insects in the landscape as well. So for broadleaf trees, for a lot of things, unless you're seeing it across the whole plant, it's okay to not worry about it or to not have an immediate reaction to those. Again, send us some pictures, tell us about your situation. I'd be happy to help you out with your specific situation on what I think should happen. So again, yeah, tolerate in many situations, prune those heavily infested areas, but in some cases, they can cause some damage to fruits and vegetables. We see this apple here on the left that was damaged by woolly apple aphid. It's present here. It can do damage here. but rarely is it going to get this bad unless you have a legitimate issue, which certainly, if, I think you'll know if you have a major issue. And if you start to see the population grow, then that can be time to start to take some different actions rather than the hands removing and spraying. But get in touch with us. I'd be happy to help you as much as I can. Okay, another fan favorite, thrips. These are also very common and more of an issue in drought years. Really, they're hard to identify because they are so small and they're slender and they tend to jump when you disturb them or poke them. But if you tend to see a really tiny, almost microscopic insect and you think that it might be a mite, but it's really slender, and then you can kind of like poke around at them on the leaves and they jump or they scatter really quickly. Usually those are thrips. You can identify them a little bit easier if you do have a magnifying hand lens, or I'm sure there's some phone cameras out there that can do a pretty good job at zooming in on them. Uh, they're usually thrips if you see that elongated tiny thing running around your plants. But again, there's so many other options. So get in touch with me if you need to. They do have fringed wings under magnification, which is one of their key identification characteristics. I have to note, though, that there are some beneficial thrips out there, which is why it's really bad to just have that gut reaction, find a thrip, and then spray all of your plants with some sort of pesticide, because there are thrips out there that eat pest thrips. There's thrips out there that eat things like spider mites and aphids as well. So if you do see a lot of your plants that have thrips on them and you're seeing a lot of these little black spots or some discoloration, that can be a sign that you're having some thrips feeding on your plants. So if you see a lot of this sort of thing in the right-hand photo, then that's probably a situation where you're having a lot of plant feeding thrips on your plants. And again, doesn't necessarily mean that you need to immediately take action, but it does mean that we can take a further look into that, or a closer look to see if we need to take any chemical action or some other management strategy. So as soon as you get foliage, just like a lot of the other insects, start monitoring those plants. You can use the hose technique for thrips as well. And if you constantly do it, you're going to knock the thrips off onto the ground. If they're covered in water, they're probably going to drown in that water. Encouraging beneficial insects again. So not just having the first gut reaction of, I found one plant with a bunch of thrips, let me just spray the entire garden. Encourage beneficial insects. You can do that by not immediately spraying your plants with pesticides, and also companion plantings. If you're not familiar with companion plantings, that is planting other just flowering plants. It doesn't matter if it's annual or perennial. There's some more specific guidelines I can share there to really encourage a lot of other beneficial insects and give resources to beneficial insects in the landscape. And then in severe cases, there are definitely some chemical options here. One thing that I should have put in the notes, I'm looking at it now. I think I did. So I mentioned that, I did. So thrips are really attracted to sticky traps. And there's the most commonly available sticky trap are the yellow colored ones. Thrips tend to like the color blue. And if you do enough searching online, you can find blue colored sticky traps. And I think if you have the option to do yellow and that's all that's easily available, go ahead and utilize yellow color sticky traps. They work just fine for like capturing thrips and getting a general sense of the population in the area. But blue tends to work really, really well. So if you just want to try it for fun, throw some blue cards out there and see what you get on it. I did some research with a friend of mine out in Utah, or he did the research. I was just kind of there observing on limiting the amount of bycatch. Actually, I think I have a slide on this. That's weird. The slide is showing up in, oh, odd. Anyway, so you can utilize blue, and another reason that's good is because blue color tends to limit the amount of bycatch that you get, or can limit the amount of bycatch. Bees are also attracted to the color yellow a little bit more than blue. Beneficial parasitic wasps can be more attracted to blue or yellow than blue. So blue, maybe there's some evidence out there that putting blue out there will limit the impact to other pollinators and other insects. So that can be a plus as well. Okay. So apple maggot is next. I did get a couple of samples of apple maggot this year, or in 2023, which is why I put this in here. And good identification characteristic is that if you're seeing a small fly that has striped wings and a striped body on an apple, it's probably apple maggot. There are theoretically some other options out there, but apple maggot is without a doubt the most common one that we're seeing in Iowa, at least from what I've read. Again, I haven't lived here for that long. So the fruit also has a good characteristic of these little sunken areas that we're seeing on the right here. from the areas where the apple maggot is laying their eggs, piercing the fruit, and then some associated feeding from the larvae underneath of that. So these are really good diagnostic characteristics. If you're seeing that adult flying on the apples, or if you're seeing this dimpling and sunken areas on apples as they mature, the larvae are also easy to find if you cut into your apples and they actually have apple maggot. So you can have some rotten or discolored areas of flesh, but certainly you don't necessarily find them unless you're cutting your apples open. Prevention is definitely key for apple maggots. So this is one where yellow sticky cards do work really well. I don't really care for the placement of the one that's in this photograph. And that's only because I have a lot of experience hanging yellow sticky traps and I don't like getting bycatch. I'm a person that unless my apple maggots were completely destroying all of my apples, which is totally possible, by the way, uh, this is going to capture a lot of beneficial insects in an orchard setting or in a home garden. And sometimes yellow sticky traps can even capture birds, which is one of the most sad things I've ever seen in my life. So if I am to place, or if I were to place a yellow sticky trap like this, I like to kind of hide it in the canopy a little bit. It might limit the amount of flies that are being attracted to it, but it can also really limit some of those beneficial insects, or a bird just accidentally flying into it and getting, I've had some yellow sticky traps that have had bird feathers just kind of stuck to it everywhere. The birds have escaped and I'm sure they were fine in the long term, but it's just really not fun to see that or to deal with that, especially if you walk up to a trap that actually has a bird stuck. It's never happened to me, but I'm sure it's happened to somebody. So you can try to like maybe encourage these traps to be a little bit further from the exterior of the tree, but still make sure that there's visibility of that trap to a lot of the flies that are flying around and getting that color cue of that yellow color that they're attracted to. So utilize those yellow sticky traps. You have to get apple maggot before they become a problem. Once your fruit is infested, you're kind of done for. So put these out earlier in the season as your plants start to blossom and you start to get some fruit starting to grow. If you have any fruit that falls because they're infested or from some other issue, remove those fruits from the ground, get them out of there. We don't want to leave a lot of that debris on the ground because it just is more habitat for apple maggot and other insects to live in. And then for insecticides, there are some options there, and definitely insecticides are probably used more frequently, or I recommend them for apple maggot more frequently than some other insect pests. But the problem is you have to apply them frequently because apple maggot has several generations, and you need to just apply for as long as they're in the field, and that's typically from June to September, depending on weather. Okay, I am getting a little bit close on time here. So I put these scale slides in here because they have very complicated life histories. They're very complicated insects. So because I want to spend 15 minutes or so answering questions, I'm going to kind of jump through here. I just brought these up because they're super interesting. I still have a lot to learn about scale. They all have these complicated life histories and development stages. Essentially, there are hard and soft scales. For the sake of time, I'm just going to mention that scale are typically either helmet-like, they look like a dome on a plant. I think on the next slide, I have a really good picture of this, or at least, oh yeah, actually I do. Or they tend to be, this is a really weird one called oyster shell scale. This is another really common scale species, but they just look like little hardened sections of, sometimes they're assumed to be bark, especially oyster shell scale that puts a lot of their, or like to hang out on the stems and bark and things like that. So if you see anything that looks hardened and it looks like a random bump on your plant that you're not really familiar with, there's a decent chance that it's scale. They can produce honeydew, some of them, which can cause sooty mold production on your plants, which can limit photosynthetic properties or photosynthetic ability of your plant. So they can have a lot of really bad downsides to them. There are so many species out there that feed on so many plants. One example, so this is just kind of that complicated life history in the dome shape that I was talking about. So this is some little leaf area or stem area of a plant. We have this huge dome shape, which is actually the adult insect itself. Again, super complicated. We're not going to get into too many details. And then these little pink guys crawling around, pinkish orange guys, are the crawler stage. So a different life stage of the scale. They look entirely different. It's kind of mind-blowing. I'll mention that the crawler stage of the insect is the easiest to manage. So well, let me get into this next slide actually, or these next two slides because it'll explain it a little better. I'm going to kind of zip through this. So this is just one example, San Jose scale, which is a hard scale that is present in Iowa. Can be a really bad pest in some areas of the US. They're essentially sap suckers, so they can, in San Jose scale's case, it can feed directly on the fruit. We have a lot of scale scattered on this plant here, and we have a lot of these little halo shapes around the apples or where they're situated on the apples. In really severe cases, they can kill plants, but they can certainly stunt your plant's growth and damage your fruits directly. So scale can be really problematic. Again, there's so many species out there and so many issues on specific plants. Don't have time to get into it, but if you see anything dome-shaped on your plant, send us some pictures. I'd be happy to try to identify that scale. Scale identification is very hard because there are a lot of species that look just like this or close to it. Just very, very complicated and interesting insects. And it's just weird that you can have this crawler stage that looks nothing like the adults. They go through this weird like pupal stage that is not a true pupa. They don't pupate like a butterfly or moth would. Anyway, very interesting organisms here. They're another one that you can prune infested limbs regardless of what type of scale it is. You can use dormant oils, and if you do use insecticides, you have to monitor for this little crawler stage. And I put some notes in the little note section below the slide in the handout that tells you how to do that. Okay, so just a quick take home here. It is imperative that you correctly identify an insect before you take any steps in responding to it, because it might not be at pest status, it might not be a pest at all, it could be something beneficial. The amount of dead beneficial insects that I see in photos and in samples is quite sad. A lot of times we get samples sent into the clinic that have a lot of pests on them, but at the same rate, we find a lot of parasitoid wasps in the same sample, which is telling me there's already some things doing some work out there for you. It's not good to go spray a pesticide and kill all these beneficial insects. I see that all the time. Very, very frequent submission. So always seek that identification help, but chemical intervention is a really good last resort thing in most situations. Not all, but most. So I encourage anybody to contact me with questions or IDs if I don't get a chance to answer it here. We just opened up a text line that is for insect identification photos only. For now, if you have any plant questions or plant pest questions in general, you can also just email us at pidc@iastate.edu. And again, we have our main lab line here at the bottom right.